Now we're going to move on to today's perspective, and my guest today is a man who was there on October the 7th when Hamas fighters invaded Israel. He and his wife and 2 daughters were woken on their kibbutz by the sound of missiles and soon understood that the day would be unlike any other. In all, more than 60 Israeli soldiers and 15 civilians in and around the kibbutz were killed, some also kidnapped and taken to the Gaza Strip. Well, Amir Tibon is a journalist for Haaretz, now author of a new book. It's called The Gates of Gaza in English, also out in French as well, in fact, at Portes de Gaza. He joins us now. The book also saying on its front cover a story of betrayal, survival and hope as well in Israel's borderlands. First of all, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, just tell us what happened on that day.
Well, we woke up at 6:30 a.m. from the sound of mortars being launched from Gaza toward my community, a small kibbutz, an agricultural village called Nahal Oz, which is located 800 meters from the Israel-Gaza border, on the Israeli side of the border. And that bombardment was followed by a ground invasion of Hamas terrorists into the kibbutz. More than 100 of them entered our community, which is a completely civilian place. Families, children. Saturday morning, the terrorists went from home to home, trying to murder and kidnap people. They also arrived at my house around 7:15. They fired a lot of bullets through our living room window, and my wife and I were sheltering in a small room, dark, no electricity, no food, with 2 very young girls, 3.5-year-old and 2-year-old. Those are the ages of my daughters. I want to point out there are videos that the Hamas fighters took with cameras on their helmets as they were attacking our house. And you can see in the videos the baby stroller behind them. So they knew there was a baby in this house and they kept going. There was a fight for the kibbutz between a small group of soldiers and several heroes from our local security team in the community who fought to try to repel these terrorists. And sadly, while it could have been worse, because in other communities in Israel on that day you had many dozens of people killed. Still in our kibbutz, 15 people were killed and murdered, and 7 of our friends were kidnapped into Gaza, 2 of whom, Tzachi, Dan and Omri Miran, fathers of young children, friends of mine, are still in the hands of Hamas as we speak, almost a year later.
And what was your primary instinct as all that was going on? Just of survival, I suppose?
So what we did, we first of all tried to keep our girls calm and relaxed, because we were in a dark room with no electricity. The terrorists could not see us and we could not see them. But we could hear the terrorists because they were firing bullets in our living room. And we knew that if they heard us, they would come to find us and kill us. And so we had to stay quiet, and that meant we had to keep our girls very calm and quiet. And this was our primary focus. We could not show any signs of distress or fear, because we thought that if we did, the girls would pick up on it and begin to cry. And at the same time, I called my parents, who live in Tel Aviv. They are 62 years old. My father is a retired high-ranking officer in the Israeli military. My mother is a former high school principal. And I informed them of the situation. And they decided to come from Tel Aviv to our kibbutz as this was happening. It's an hour and 10 minutes drive. Israel is a very small country. Tel Aviv and Gaza are not that far away. And one of the things I tell in the book is the dramatic story of how my parents came from Tel Aviv to try to rescue us and helped rescue other people from this attack along the way. And that story, I combine it with other stories from what happened in my kibbutz on that day to give people a better perspective of the events of October 7 from a family and community and national outlook.
So was that your first instinct once that had happened? I mean, you are a journalist, so to write it down and put it into a book?
It took me a little time to start writing. We left our community on the night of October 7, after my father had arrived from Tel Aviv and joined the soldiers in the fight for the kibbutz. And we were all evacuated around midnight in a bus that took us out, while the community behind us, our homes, the kindergarten of our children, it was on fire. The terrorists, before losing control to the Israeli military, had set the place on fire. And we went to a community in central Israel that agreed to host us. Each family received a little room, smaller than this studio. And so my wife and I, we had, 4 mattresses on the floor, 2 for us, 2 for the girls. That's how we lived for about a month and a half. Funerals, times of mourning for all the friends we lost. We were fighting for the lives of our friends who are still in Gaza, the 7 hostages. And around the end of November, life stabilized a little bit. My girls began to go to kindergarten again. My wife found a job in the area we were evacuated to. And that's when I told myself, I have to sit down and write this story for the sake of history. And because, sadly, so many people in the world are trying to deny or minimize or justify the October 7 attack, and I wanted to tell the story of what happened and of the people it happened to. Not just my own family, but also others in my community, and explain how this happened.
I mean, you do analyse it a little bit as well in the book, don't you, and talk about the conflict and the analysis of what's happened since and of what Benjamin Netanyahu's government has done.
Yes, what I did in the book, and this was a decision I made early on, I decided to write 2 timelines that go in parallel. There's the timeline of October 7, which begins at 6:30 in the morning with the first mortar launched at our neighborhood. And then there's the timeline of the history of my kibbutz, and through it, the history of Israel and Gaza, which goes back really to 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, the Nakba for the Palestinians. And I write about the relationship between this small Israeli community right on the border with Gaza and the Palestinians on the other side, all the way until October 6, a day before the attack. And I think this was important because without understanding the history, you cannot fully understand the significance of October 7. And I write about times of fighting that happened long before October 7, but also about times when there was hope for peace. One event I describe in the book is a peace festival that happened within my kibbutz in 1994, in which we had hundreds of guests coming from Gaza, a very dramatic event when you compare it to what happened 3 decades later. And so for me, also adding in this analytical level and historical perspective was very important, because otherwise we're only left with the horror. We're only left with the sheer emotion, and we need also to understand how and why it happened.
And what do you think about the reaction from Israel? I mean, not just in Gaza, but also over the last few days of what's happened in Lebanon as well?
Well, when Hamas attacked Israel the way it did on October 7, it unleashed a terrible war, which tragically has also led to catastrophic results in Gaza. And I think this is one of the issues I try to deal with toward the end of the book. I, as an Israeli whose family was almost murdered on October 7, I fully supported the war. And I understood that Israel had to retaliate. We're in a very difficult neighborhood surrounded by enemies that want to destroy us. But at the same time, I also don't deny the fact that the results of the war in Gaza have been catastrophic and heartbreaking. And that if we want to avoid this kind of terrible thing in the future, we have to think about how this war ends and how we build on the day after a better future for Israel and for Gaza. I believe Hamas cannot and should not be part of that future. I also am advocating for a change of government in Israel because of the failures that we saw on October 7. And we have to think how, from this terrible place that we've been dragged into by fanatics and extremists, we can try to build something better for the future of our children. Israeli children, Palestinian children, because otherwise we are doomed to repeat this terrible thing again and again.
Yeah, bearing in mind what's happened, is there a way to do that?
Well, you know, I'm sitting with you here in Paris, and if you look at the history of Europe and all the bloody wars that happen over here, and you compare it to the situation today, I was in Germany yesterday promoting the German edition of the book. I took a flight from Berlin to Paris, no passport control on the way. So history shows us that peace can be possible even after the most terrible and disastrous wars. But it demands, first of all, a very real and honest conversation about the failures of the current leadership, about the ideologies that have brought us to this terrible place. You know, and we talk about Hamas, it has a clearly genocidal ideology that wants to clear Israel off the map. And you have very, very extreme voices in Israel that advocate to expel Palestinians. And these are not the kind of things that will bring us to the place we want to be. We need to think about a way, at the end of the day, how the millions of Israelis and the millions of Palestinians in this small land, and nobody is going anywhere, how we can share it and live in a way that creates something better for our children, so that October 7 and the post-October 7 war never happen again.
Good to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Amir Tibon is a journalist for Haaretz, also author of the new book. It's called The Gates of Gaza in English, also out here in French. I've got the French copy with me, Les Portes de Gaza. Amir Tibon, thanks very much once again.
Thank you.